Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm Paul TX14 Walsh, welcoming you to an all new Ace in the Day gameplay for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode I shall be reviewing the Firefly FR Mk.V, a British naval fighter coming into Tier 3 and a battle rating of 4.0. Having already covered the history behind the Firefly from its inception through to the Mark 1 variant in our review of the Firefly Mark 1, link available in the top right corner of your screen as displayed now. Today's historical overview is going to focus on the remaining combat subvariants of the Firefly, ranging from the subvariants of the Mark 1 through to and beyond the plane you're seeing on screen today. With that, let's begin. With the Firefly Mark 1 in mainstream service of the Fleet Air Arm of the British Royal Navy by the end of 1943, work soon began on improving the plane's capabilities, starting with the addition of ASH radar to generate the FR Mark 1 subvariant, FR standing for Fighter Reconnaissance. The NF Mark II subvariant soon followed as a dedicated night fighter, as denoted by the initials NF. This featured a lengthened fuselage in order to accommodate the airborne interception AI radar equipment. However, early tests of the NF Mark II showed that the AI radar equipment could be carried in a pod under the engine, like the ASH radar of the FR Mark I, leading to the NF Mark II's production run being abandoned in favour of a night fighter subvariant of the Mark I, designated the NF Mark I, which saw the ASH radar pod replaced with an AI radar pod instead. The next proposed Firefly variant was the Mark III, which was to feature a Rolls-Royce Griffon 61 series V12 engine, promising an output of 2,035 horsepower, instead of the Griffon 12 series engines as fitted to the Firefly Mark Is, or at least the last 334 aircraft, providing 1,765 horsepower. However, only one prototype of the Mark III was built, as development work quickly switched to the F Mark IV as the second half of 1944, the sole F standing for fighter. The Mark IV was to see a significant redesign of the aircraft, implementing a new wing leading edge radiator system to cool the planned Griffon 74 2,250 horsepower engine that would be fitted, new nacelles in the outer section of the wing that could carry both fuel and an ASH radar set, and the introduction of clipped wingtips to improve the plane's roll rate. The prototype Mark IV flew for the first time by the end of 1944, but the plane only entered service with its fighter reconnaissance subvariant, the FR Mark IV, in July of 1946. The service career of the Mark IV was cut short by the arrival of the Mark V, which entered service in December of 1947. Whilst extremely similar to the Mark IV, the Mark V was a multi-purpose aircraft whose subvariant designation reflected its role. Firstly, there was the core subvariant known as the RF Mark V, the plane you're seeing on screen today, RF standing for Reconnaissance Fighter, a reversal of the in-game designation of Fighter Reconnaissance to show that the plane lent more towards the reconnaissance role rather than the fighter role. This aircraft was armed with 4 20mm Hispano Mark V cannon as mounted in the wings. Secondly, there was the NF Mark V, the night fighter variant, which featured additional AI radar equipment and flame damping exhausts. And finally, there was the AS Mark V, the first anti-submarine subvariant of the Firefly that could carry American sonar buoys or mines under wing. The 352 Mark Vs produced in total were succeeded in March 1949 by the Mark VI, which was a dedicated anti-submarine aircraft which had its 20mm cannon removed to make space for additional wing-mounted sonar buoys and mines. This time, however, the equipment was British, not American. The AS Mark VI was the last Firefly subvariant to see combat service, being retired from British service in 1956 and replaced by the Fairey Gannet. And so with our historical overview concluded, let us take a look at how the Firefly FR Mark V handles in the skies of War Thunder Arcade. Today's gameplay is brought to you from the frontline map Gorge. For this we'll be using the following setup. Air target belts are a 20mm cannon, the reason being in my experience these belts are the most powerful on offer, being able to down any given aircraft with well aimed bursts within a 1 to 2 second period. On top of that, you must consider the bonus that the high explosive fragmentation incendiary and high explosive fragmentation semi-armor piercing incendiary rounds within these belts do not have a tracer component, meaning that you can open fire on foes at distances in excess of 1 kilometre and surprise them with sudden hits. Alternatively, get onto the 6 of an unsuspecting foe, and if you happen to miss, they'll have no tracer whizzing past their cockpit to alert them to your incoming presence on their tail. Our gun convergence is set to 600 metres. This is to accommodate the typically longer distances of engagement in this aircraft, because what you have to consider is it's a rather slow plane for its battle rating, and the opposition we're going up against will be able to keep their distance from us, such as enemy bombers, therefore we need to open fire at longer distances. Alternatively, in a turn fight when we do gain the upper hand, our foes will be able to pull to a distance of 500 meters or more before we get the first chance to open firing down them, and this gun convergence setting will counter that. As for our fuel load, we are taking the minimum fuel load of 40 minutes to ensure we can make it to the end of the game, unscathed on fuel capacity. We begin our analysis then by talking about the climb rate of the Firefly Mk.V, and what we find is that its battle rating is subpar, in that the vast majority of its opposition will at least be able to climb with it, if not outclimb it completely, and planes such as the Messerschmitt 109 F4, the Spitfire Mk.V-B, the Focke 190A4, the Yakovlev Yak-9U, the Yakovlev Yak-3, the I-185 M82, the A6M3 Mod 22, all these planes come within that category, and there's so many more. I mean, instead, you have to think about your maneuverability in order to be able to turn the tables on those foes, able to outrace you to altitude, whether it be in a straight line or climbing above you and then coming down on you, such as the F4U-1D Corsair coming up towards us here, and we're thinking they're using their speed in order to yo-yo up towards us after attacking one of our friendlies earlier on. Instead they're going for our friendly MB-162, so here we're going to surprise them by countering using the split S, and we'll see the lethality of the Hispano Mk.V cannon, a very quick kill. We were hoping to use the same tactic against the TA-154A1 heavy fighter coming down, but as they've gone for our friendly Yakovlev Yak-3, which has gone upwards for a bit before reacting to the incoming heavy fighter, it means we're not going to be able to follow the target and bring them down, so instead we have to fly away to fight another day. But you can see there immediately the maneuverability that the Firefly has, and let's start to talk more about that. In its ideal speed range of 325 to 450 km an hour, you'll find that this plane's control surfaces in general are firm but nice to handle. They will feel a little bit heavy compared to your typical fighter, but at the end of the day this is a naval fighter and you should expect that. It is going to be heavier than your typical land-based fighter. But with turn circle, your turn circle is above average, comparable to the likes of a Typhoon Mk.1B later at a battle rating of 4.7. A little bit behind a Spitfire Mk.V-B for comparison, but with the addition of your combat or your landing flat, you can really tighten that turn to the point you're going to take a lot of foes by surprise in the turn fight. These foes including the likes of a Focke 190A4, a Yakovlev Yak-3, an I-185 M82, and you get the picture. As a result, do not write this plane off as being a poor fighter, as it can turn fight rather well, and we're about to see that against the PBJ and the TA-154A1 coming back in. We have to consider these are both effectively heavy fighters, albeit the PBJ is the bomber converted into a heavy fighter stroke ground attack role from what I recall historically, but we can see the maneuverability in action. Now we must start off with the roll rate of this plane, considering that the clipped wings give this plane a roll rate advantage over its predecessor variant, i.e. the Mk.I, and this means you can snap roll rather well on the fly and evade incoming fighting head on. In coming around now, we're going to react to the TA-154A1 coming down on top of us, using the split S from earlier but cancelling it at the last moment to roll through and go into a barrel roll, forcing the TA-154A1 to overshoot. And here we can start to use our rather heavy elevator to follow the TA-154 going up before they cut over, doing another barrel roll effectively, and we can stay right on their 6 at this point, not having to worry about losing them in this engagement, only having to worry about getting a clear shot on target, which we managed setting the left hand wing on fire, and now we're trying to finish them off. Unfortunately, with the sound of the PBJ behind us here, we're starting to panic, but the PBJ is actually overshot and we decide to finish them off using the quick fire of our cannon, before trying to swing down on the TA-154 to finish them. But here I panic, simply because look how close I am to the enemy airfield and therefore the enemy spawn, and one thing this plane is not good at is getting away from a sticky situation. So I need to brake whilst I've got a clear window of opportunity. I mean, I'm not going to be able to finish off that heavy fighter, which is wounded but is going to be able to land and get back up into the sky later. But still, in that 2 versus 1, we can see the application of the strong roll rate of this plane, and on top of that the balance across the control surfaces. We saw the application of the rudder to a small extent, where it benefited our turn circle in particular, in coming around a little bit faster. And what we do find is the rudder of this plane is average at best. It's not great, your flat rudder turn circle is rather lengthy, but by adding the rudder into manoeuvres such as your standard turn or a hammerhead, it can make the difference in some circumstances. The weakest control surface aspect is the elevator because of its heaviness. On top of that, this plane has a rather weird turning circle in the loop. Or I should just say a loop circle. Now typically when a plane loops on its elevator, you'll find that it conducts a circle. In this plane, you cannot loop in a circle as such, you actually cut your loop circle in two. In that as you go into loop at say 400 km an hour level flight, you'll find that the plane gets to the peak of the loop at 200 km an hour or so. These are just approximate numbers, but then the loop is cut in half because this plane no longer has the momentum to finish the loop. I mean, you actually loop in position, so you go up and then come down on yourself. And this is great for throwing those foes who try to use loops in order to get onto your 6, so because as they go through their whole loop circle, you'll be cutting their loop circle in half. but those who realise this will then start to use tricks such as flat rudder turning above you to swing down on you via a hammerhead, so it can be countered rather easily. But this is something to keep in mind in those difficult engagements. So therefore, across the balance of the control surfaces, you will find that this plane does work well in a turn fighter mode. But already with the difficulty in the elevator, this combines into another poorer aspect of this plane, and that is its overall energy retention. In the vertical, the energy retention of this plane is rather poor, in that you're only able to conduct short distance boom and zoom dives where you can conserve the energy you started with. Diving from say 4,000 meters altitude at a speed of 300 kilometers an hour, you'll find that in a dead 90-degree dive, you can drop 1,250 meters altitude before return climbing at a 30-degree angle and engine power alone, and you'll be able to return to your starting altitude at approximately the same speed as what you started with. Beyond this, however, you're going to start bleeding kinetic energy rather noticeably. In the horizontal, your energy retention is a little bit better, but do be aware of the fact that your landing flaps and even your combat flaps will bleed significant amounts of energy from this plane, more so than a typical fighter perhaps, and land-based fighter at that, so therefore you can lose a lot of energy in this manner and it can take you by surprise. There we saw the lethality of the Hispano Mk.V cannon longer distances and the Heinkel 111, emphasising our point from earlier of being able to use our 600 meter gun convergence at the longer distances and the lack of tracer to catch our bomber foes by surprise, or even enemy fighters, we can also do that. And as for this Halifax, we can see unfortunately we weren't able to get close enough due to our slow nature to be able to attack that enemy bomber successfully. Perhaps we should have opened fire a little bit later, so that way we didn't bleed as much kinetic energy when we opened fire with our cannon until we got close enough to do so and be more accurate. But in general you can see that the difficulty in intercepting a bomber that's travelling at a pace and knows where it's going. Now going for the reload here, let's talk about ammo capacity. You have 640 rounds in total. This is plenty, albeit the fire rate of the Hispano Mk.V cannon is very fast, so you will exhaust your ammo rather quickly, so you do need to balance this out. You have ample ammunition to allow yourself to miss the target a number of times, or if the target's just proven incredibly durable because you can't get that really clean shot, it means you've got the ammo to make up for that. But if you hold down the trigger for too long, you'll find yourself running dry sooner than you realise, and that reload is going to be important. Now here we're going for the PBY, and we can see again how we're having to converge on a target in interception. I mean, this cannot be seen as a dedicated bomber interceptor plane, but it will work in the interceptor role when it's defending its ground units, so it's home defense effectively, as we bring down the Catalina for another kill, and our allies finally bring down the Halifax that we're considering diving down on ourselves. Note on top of this then, how we're not able to get to altitude that rapidly. And this comes in with the climb rate from earlier, but it also comes into another aspect that we haven't explored yet, and that is the ideal altitude range versus the maximum altitude range of this plane. Starting with the maximum altitude range, what you'll find is at 3,500 meters, there is already a noticeable penalty on the plane's engine performance in terms of straight line acceleration, which from the outset is average at best, going from your stall speed of 135 km an hour to 350 km an hour at a decent rate but nothing exceptional, and with more emergency power you can kick this up to 450 km an hour. But when you get above 3,500 meters, your acceleration peters off noticeably, and this only gets worse as you go to 4,000 meters plus. At 5,000 meters plus, you'll find that your climb rate starts to drop off in not too quick a fashion, but by the time you get to 5,500 meters, it will become noticeable. So this makes going to altitude to intercept enemy bombers or go to tackle enemy fighters rather difficult, simply because your performance is at such a disadvantage. And therefore instead what you need to consider is that you're going to be pushed more towards low to medium altitude. And this is backed up by your control surfaces as well, in the fact that your control surfaces start to become heavy on all fronts once you get to 5,000 meters altitude. But conversely, in the ideal altitude range of 1,500 to 3,000 meters altitude, this plane feels rather wonderful to fly. The control surfaces will respond well, particularly in the ideal speed range, and even if you go down to say 1,000 meters altitude, you're not hit with a penalty to performance as we dive down towards this enemy Typhoon and go for the head-to-head. And here be where you can use this plane in a head-to-head role, but if you're not too accurate and you let your foe get too close, there we're fortunate in the fact that we guessed right it was going to be a Typhoon Mark 1A. If it had been a Typhoon Mark 1B late, the 20mm cannon would have seen us torn to pieces. As we carry our momentum through against the Heinkel 111H here, again we can rip apart this bomber before it becomes a considerable threat to our team. But note here how we took a very light glancing blow from one of their machine guns, and already we're taking some damage to our cooling system. And this is important in terms of durability and comes back to what I said earlier about not getting too close to enemy bombers and using the 600 meter gun convergence. The durability of this plane is rather poor. In general it seems susceptible to taking maximum possible damage wherever possible. I appreciate that weaponry has been buffed over time, particularly cannon, but in this plane you'll find that the wingtips will come flying off if you're hit by even a light burst of machine gun fire, even from say a 7.7mm Browning machine gun, and on top of that when you're hit by 20mm cannon, expect the worst to happen. Add to that in particular the poor durability of the engine in this plane, where it can very easily just take a single hit to be completely decimated out of the game, and life becomes very difficult. The only upside is this plane is not too flammable, with there only being one fuel tank mounted behind the cockpit. Just be aware when it does get hit, it'll bleed all the fuel and you'll lose all your fuel and have no fuel to get back home. With that, the game ends. It's time for us to take a look at the post-game stats. With our 6 kills and 2 assists, we're able to pick up 21,422 silver lions and 2,146 research points. To defeat the Firefly FR Mk.V in a given matchup then, we've already recommended one potential approach, and that is to use your superior climb rate in the majority of the planes that you're going to fly and see this plane when flying in order to get above this aircraft and strike it hard from above via boom and zoom. Option number 2 is to force this plane to follow you into a high speed dive, and there's 2 reasons for this. Firstly, the dive speed acceleration of this plane is rather on the low side, in the fact that it takes a long time to get up to 800 km/h alone, and even longer once it goes beyond this point to get to its maximum dive speed of 887 km/h, and the vast majority of the fighters it will face will be able to outrun it in the dive as a result, having the higher dive maximum and the better dive acceleration. Add to that the poor controllability with increasing speed, where your roll rate locks up between 500 and 700 km/h, losing 50% of its performance. The rudder locks up between 600 to 700 km/h, losing 50% of its performance, and between 700 and 750 km/h, the elevator loses 25% of its performance as part of a lockup threshold, and you'll find this plane becomes difficult to follow an opponent in a dive, only being well suited to following bombers that also compromise their manoeuvrability with increasing speed in the dive. Therefore, going to these high speeds in the dive, you can then snap around using your superior control surface responsiveness in planes such as the P-51 D5 Mustang in order to bring the plane around, get onto the 6th the Firefly FR Mk.V, who will typically have to bolt on in a straight line, albeit they have poor straight line energy retention, or the fact they can only start to hold their speed from 590 km/h or less, and this means that you can get onto the 6th and bring this plane down before it's able to get the speed of the dogfight down to a line-off speed, i.e. the ideal speed range of 325 to 450 km/h, to turn the advantage back in their favour. But by avoiding such circumstances in our own Firefly FR Mk.V today, hopefully what we've demonstrated is that this naval fighter, for its battle rating, whilst not great in most regards, does have the ability to surprise those who would choose to underestimate it, particularly in terms of turn fighting. This plane is not going to be the first to get to 5,000 metres plus, nor is it going to have the performance to sustain its position up on high. But in the low to medium altitude range, particularly 1,500 to 3,000 metres, if you engage this plane, stay away from it in a turn fight, because as soon as it gains the upper hand, it's only going to need a clean burst on your plane for 1 to 2 seconds to rip you to pieces. And if you see this plane on your path as a bomber and flying towards ground targets, be wary that it's going to be waiting for you, and their pilot is going to be cackling at the controls simply because they may be succumbing to Hispano Hysteria. So I've been TX141, and if you have enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, that next weekend we'll be celebrating a big milestone for this channel, as it will be our 150th Arcade Air Battles review. I'm not going to reveal what the plane is, but be sure to tune in as we've got something special planned. But until next time, as always, ladies and gentlemen, take care and good luck in the skies.